Good morning. I'm Corby Kummer from The Atlantic, where many of my distinguished colleagues are gathered, especially our treasurer James Fallows, whose every word I hope you read, on our website and his website. And I'm also the editor of the Ideas, the magazine of the Aspen Institute, plentiful copies of which are outside for your perusing pleasure. I also write about food, and I've written recently about food waste. Luckily, what we have today is a panel. This is the brain trust of food waste, or as we were saying the other day, wasted food. Stop talking food waste, abolish that term. So we'll see if you all have your own recommendations for what we should be calling it. And also, just as you're going to hear from Tristram Stuart, our international activist and author, he puts on many dinners called Feeding the 5,000. And they're international gatherings at which many, many people will come together and understand just how good food is that might otherwise be thrown out, wasted, disposed of. So the Institute, the Meadows here, had the challenge of thinking, what if we tried to do something inspired by this very idea? Could we change our own supply chain? Where could we go out and find food that was nearing its expiration date, would otherwise be lost? And as you will find out, and Tristram will have much more on-the-ground experience telling us about, it's not so easy. So it took them weeks, and they had to go beg Whole Foods and say, you know, where is the produce you're about to throw out? How can I get it? I think they got it at reduced rates, but I think that they were pretty much begging. So maybe they didn't even get discounts on it. So some of the places they went, so the Meadows chef is named J.T. Thompson. And we at the Ideas Festival have a meeting every morning at the charming hour of 7 a.m. And we go through the various logistics of the day. But today, the main achievement of the entire staff was J.T. Thompson and the cooks right here. This is the only venue at the Ideas Festival where this lunch is being offered, who spent the last week or two trying to find the materials with which to make this lunch. So they did it by going to Whole Foods, and Jason from Rock Bottom Ranch also helped supply some of the foods that could be sold at deep discounts, should be used, but might not normally be marketed at its full price and lost, wasted. We're going to hear a lot about that today. But first, since it was so good, maybe the best food we're going to have all week, could we have a round of applause for the chefs? I'm really delighted to be in this panel, but I'm also eager for the end of time when I can go back and have thirds and seconds. But you can go back and help yourself to seconds all during the panel. So, the panel. We will have today the fortune of having a global context, global and domestic context. And we're going to start with Zia Khan, who is manager of programs, vice president of the Rockefeller Foundation. And he manages many of the programs that the Aspen Institute enacts, and specifically has been thinking about post-harvest loss in Africa and other countries, and will tell us something about his and the Foundation's thoughts about lost food and what we can do to try to change food systems.
Sure, thank you, Corey. And I want to say thanks to the Aspen Institute for putting on this amazing festival and creating the space for this important discussion. Also my co-panelists here, from whom I've learned a lot just in a short period of time. Just to give you a little bit of background about the Rockefeller Foundation and how we came to this issue. The Rockefeller Foundation is a philanthropy that's existed for 103 years. And what's interesting, throughout all of our history, agriculture has been something that we've touched on, just because food is so important to our nutrition, to our well-being, to our livelihoods, to economic development. And so from the very early days when we worked on rural education in the South, and agriculture was important to develop the tax base, to the 50s and 60s when we sponsored a lot of the fundamental research that led to the Green Revolution and helped solve big famine issues in India and Southeast Asia, to more recent years where we've been focusing on how do we invest in research that helps agriculture become more resilient to climate change. In our most recent exploration, we scanned the globe to understand what are the pivotal issues right now where we feel there's dynamism and where we feel there's interesting solutions that we could play a role in supporting. And this issue of food loss and food waste came to the forefront. And so we recently launched a $130 million initiative that we call YieldWise, where we're focused on this global effort of how can we reduce the amount of food that's wasted. And I'm sure you're familiar with all the big statistics, but 30 to 40% basically of all the food that is grown eventually is wasted. And that has all sorts of implications when you think about the water that goes into that food, all the pesticides that go into it, and just really the wasted opportunity for people to earn a living selling that food and the lost nutrition opportunities as well. So we launched this initiative, and we're focused in two areas right now. One is in Africa, where the big problem there is food loss, which is the issue of food that gets lost between the farm and the market. And it happens for all sorts of reasons. One, farmers just don't have the opportunity to sell to markets. They don't have the technologies to store food. When they're transporting tomatoes down bumpy roads, a lot of those tomatoes go to waste. And what's interesting when we look at that problem is we see how it's in everyone's interest to solve that problem. So for example, we're partnering with Coca-Cola that makes mango juice in Kenya. And they really want a more steady supply of good, high quality mangoes. And they want to eliminate food waste. There's a lot of smallholder farmers where a lot of governments and nonprofits want to improve their income security. So they want to help them monetize all of this food waste. And then there's just domestic markets that need more high quality food. And so eliminating food waste is important there, in addition to all the environmental concerns that food waste and loss has. So we have developed an initiative that touches on all these different parts of the system in Africa to address this problem, where all these actors who can benefit from it based on their own objectives can work together in new ways to eliminate food loss. And that's exactly what we're seeing now as we're starting to do some work in the US and Europe of how do we address the issue of food waste, which is more around what happens after food gets to the market with consumers and businesses. And this is where, and we'll talk more about some of the interesting innovations, we again see an opportunity to change how the system works, how corporations engage, what are the policy levers, and importantly, what is the awareness that we need to create among consumers. And so something that we've seen in our history is these big changes in how people view what is acceptable or not in the world. And the illustration that I like to use, that many of us use, is around in the 1950s and 60s, littering was acceptable. And people just accepted the fact that you could throw garbage out your car window or leave it on the street. And through lots of efforts with innovative recycling programs, consumer awareness, legislation, that changed. And it now feels really weird to litter. And that's our vision and aspiration for this work, which is how can we make it feel very bizarre and unacceptable to waste the amount of food that we do today.
And thank you very much. Can you tell us something about the activities that you and the world can think about to reduce post-harvest loss?
Sure. So I'll give a couple of concrete examples from our work in Africa as an example. So in Africa, we can bring technology to farmers to help them reduce their food loss. And by technology, I mean very simple things like plastic buckets that they can put their bananas into a pickup truck instead of just throwing them in the pickup truck and wasting 10%. That takes a little bit of education and awareness. So we have these farmer groups that come together where we can show them about these plastic crates, teach them how to use them, but also importantly, how are they going to pay for these crates? Because they are relatively expensive for farmers right now, and that's why they're not using them. So how do we work with microfinance organizations so they can provide the financing for these kinds of technologies? And then importantly, when they produce all these extra bananas or they save all these extra bananas, where are they going to sell them to? And how do we make sure that an increase in supply doesn't then lead to a decrease in price? And so how do we create more access to markets? So it's kind of an example around bananas, around technologies that we're trying to introduce, the innovative financing mechanisms to help fund for them, but also the access to markets, which is changing. So that's one angle that we're using in some of these value chains, but there are other things that we're doing too. So something that we launched recently was a global challenge around cassava. Cassava is a really important plant crop, kind of similar, I guess, to squash. And we launched a global challenge of who has a technology that can help cassava last 4 days instead of 2 days before being processed. And we're hoping that scientists from around the world who may not even work in agriculture will have some innovative solutions that they can bring to bear. So we see our role as helping support the efforts of others, helping connect the dots in a whole system, supporting innovations where there's not enough capital and grant funding can really help, but also working with partners to raise awareness to the issue.
Well, thank you. The man who puts all of this into practice in a very Indiana Jones-like way, and I've read a lot about you, and I haven't seen the Indiana Jones comparison. You'll tell me it's very common, right? Is Tristram Stuart, to my right. English-born, author of international best-selling Waste: Uncovering the Global Food Scandal from 2009, and also The Bloodless Revolution, A Cultural History of Vegetarianism from 1600 to the present. What you'll see if you dive into waste, not akin to a dumpster dive, is a fantastic mastering of statistics and mastering of what is the scope of the problem internationally in a way that no one has done in quite as comprehensive a way. There's a wonderful book by Jonathan Bloom that I'm sure you admire. It's called American Waste?
Wasteland.
I thought it was American Wasteland, thank you. American Wasteland, which sets the scene in America, but Tristram does it internationally. And let me share with all of you one statistic that might be quite familiar to you. But at Spotlight Health, a gathering that preceded the Ideas Festival where we are today, a National Institutes of Health physicist was there talking about dietary patterns, the rise in weight, the relation between health and diet. It's so much between being fat or thin and healthy or unhealthy. It's not the connection we think it is. They're kind of independent axes of each other. But one of the things in trying to discover what is it that led to the fantastic rise in obesity from 1970 to 2010, essentially, which is the staggering immediate rise that we all see whenever we read about obesity. He was trying to think, is it sugared sodas? Is it simply the availability and the different agricultural policies that concentrated on large industrial farms, much more efficient production in the early 1970s that led to an overabundance of calories and available calories? Yes, indeed, there was an average 250 per day calorie, or per week, calorie increase in people. But what he found concurrently, and what he cares about most, was the environmental change it presages. And so what is actually less concerning to him, a physicist, is what this says about the environment. Because he requisitioned from the Environmental Protection Agency statistics about what landfill content was from 1970 to 2010. How much of it was food that could have been eaten? And it was a rise of 50% in those 40 years. And so the idea that, now we hear the horrible 30 to 40%, you probably use 40%?
In the US, yeah.
In the US, it's 40% of food produced that's not consumed, that's wasted. But to know that 50% for 40 years has been put into landfills, which is disastrous for the environment, and also incredibly wasteful, was a tremendously sobering fact to him, even apart from diets. So Tristram, you're champing at the bit because you know so much more than I.
Well, I mean, I love the way you started, Corby, because everyone here is manifesting that the solutions to this global tragedy are actually, by and large, delicious. I don't know about you, I had lunch just before this session.
I forced the panel to eat lunch just for testimonial purposes, for research.
And my testimony is, it is a total load of rubbish. I don't know what you think. And the very fact that we can eat stuff that would normally have been wasted and enjoy it is really what the message is about there. This is an environmental disaster. It's exhausting the soils. It's creating carbon dioxide emissions. We're chopping down more and more forests to grow more food, to feed more people and cater to the shift in diets globally. It is the single biggest impact we have on the environment. And at the same time, nearly 1 billion people globally are hungry. In the States alone, 50 million are not food secure. And this juxtaposition, on the one hand, of surplus and waste, both overconsumption and chucking into our garbage cans what could perfectly well be eaten, and the enormous need on the other, both to reduce our environmental impact and feed people that don't have enough, is is really one of the easiest global problems that we can solve. And we all have a role to play, both, as Zia said, in holding each other accountable and holding ourselves accountable. And this can be from, just ensuring that everything that you've bought in the grocery store ends up being turned into a meal and consumed, using leftovers, making sure that we, eat the most perishable stuff first. Those really simple, very traditional gastronomic traditions that we all have and that were live 30, 40 years ago and that we've begun to lose. But also, and this is what a lot of my work is about, is really galvanizing public opinion, not just behind personal behavior change, which we've seen an enormous shift of in the last 5 years.
What kind of shift?
Well, in the United Kingdom, we've had a 21% reduction in household food waste, which is not enough, but 21% in terms of mass behavior change. It's very difficult to find environmental movements anywhere in the world that have simultaneously triggered mass behavior change and change in policy from the big industries that are responsible for a lot of waste.
Until last week, Great Britain was the model for the world.
Oh my goodness.
Just go ahead and start.
I am still digesting the catastrophe that has been incurred upon our now divided nation. But unlike Brexit, food waste is something that we can all agree is something that we can solve. I don't know how we're going to solve that one.
You've done so much, and when I did research recently for a piece that Congresswoman Pingree was enormously helpful to me about, Great Britain was the thought leader and the action leader in changing laws. So can you lead us through some of the steps Great Britain has taken?
Yeah, and I just want to kind of caveat a little bit, because when I'm here in the States, I absolutely say, look, we've got this sorted. We changed the supermarkets policy on food donation. We've got them reporting how much food they waste. We've got voluntary agreements for waste reduction. We've really nailed the issue of holding big companies accountable for what they do, not just in their businesses, but also right the way up the supply chain. We've passed legislation. In 2013, we got a landmark piece of legislation in through the United Kingdom saying that supermarkets can no longer cancel an order at the last minute or change its forecast, resulting in farmers literally with entire crops that they're not able to sell because their customers said, we don't want it anymore. We found cheaper stuff in Guatemala this year. Sorry. All of that waste and the cost of it is in your hands. That is no longer legal. Indeed, a supermarket found doing it can be fined up to 1% of their turnover, which is colossal. That kind of power has been given to the government to investigate malfunctions or unfair trading practices that result in food waste. So yeah, I come here and I say, look, we're so far ahead. When I'm in the United Kingdom, I say, the Americans, they sussed out the idea of food recovery 30 years ago. They introduced the Good Samaritan Act, which protects companies from legal sort of liability if somebody has been given food in good faith and ended up with food poisoning, which, by the way, has never actually happened in the whole history of the planet. But
we fact check at the Aspen Institute.
Yeah, go for it. The Arkansas University just did a study to research. So probably everyone in this room has heard something about, we can't donate this food because we might be sued if somebody gets ill. Hands up who's heard that as an excuse for why food donations can't happen. The United States is the easiest country in the world for that to happen. There is the Good Samaritan Act. There are tax incentives where companies can actually recoup money from the value of the food that they donate. No other country has such favorable legislation. Now, obviously, you have to ensure the food is safe.
And we're looking at a woman who had a good deal to do with this, so we will indeed be hearing more about that.
And so that whole kind of claim that you can't do it is, sometimes it's just ignorance, and sometimes it's just the fig leaf. It's an excuse for inaction.
But please tell us about some of the actions the so far United Kingdom did take, and also Denmark and all of the enlightened Scandinavian countries.
So I would say that the really significant piece of action that I think has happened over the last 5 years in the UK and Europe is galvanizing public opinion. Yes, we've got that behavior change, but it is the public accountability. It is the public holding the businesses that we give money to every day. We pay for this system. And yet there are things going on in these supply chains that do not agree with our principles one bit. So I'll give you an example. We first went out to Kenya by invitation of UNEP, we went out again by invitation of the Rockefeller Foundation. And what we were looking at there, indeed, the excuse was to go and put on a massive meal, a bit like the one you've just had today, from food waste sourced in Kenya. And you think, no, surely in a country with millions of hungry people, they won't be wasting food like we do. And it is different. But we went into the export supply chain. So this is the Kenyan farmers growing green beans, peas, all of these wonderful vegetables to export to Europe. And because some beans are not perfectly straight or perfectly green or too fat or too thin, they're being rejected on farms. And then you get the most perfect straight beans that are ready to be exported to the UK and across Europe. And to fit them into these plastic punnets that the supermarkets have asked for, they're trimming them down to exactly 9 centimeters. Now, none of these beans know they have to be 9 centimeters long, so they grow all sorts of different lengths, silly beans. And we found that 15 to 20% of the most perfect beans were being wasted just at that final stage. And it was the symbol of absurdity in our supply chains. And like I say, I don't know anyone who thinks that farmers who cannot afford even to feed their kids are incurring these losses on that scale with such perfectly good food. So we campaigned on the issue. We did Feeding the 5,000 events across Europe where we integrated some of these beans. We took photographs and film, took them to the supermarkets themselves and said, this is the waste that your ridiculous policies are causing. Go and ask your customers if they think this is a good idea. Now, they looked at that and they said, okay.
Who's the they? What country?
This is Tesco. So Tesco is our biggest supermarket and the least traditionally sustainable. And our argument was, if we get Tesco to change, the others will follow suit. No one wants to be outdone. It's a bit like getting Walmart to change here in the US. Go for the worst, make them the best, and the others will catch up. And we've done that on a number of different policies, transparent food waste reporting being another. But let me come back to the beans, because they looked at that and said, okay, we'll change this over the night. They went from trimming both sides of the bean to just trimming one side. We got halfway within months. And that alone, that little tweak, saved 30% of waste, cut waste by 30%, which translated into value for the whole of the Kenyan bean export to the European Union amounts to $20 million. So 0.03% of the entire Kenyan economy represented in whether you trim beans at both sides or one side. And then a few weeks ago, we got an announcement they're not trimming beans at all. And guess what? That's what consumers want. And the shelf life of the beans is extended because you're not cutting it, which is where you get the blemish. And that is the kind of absurdity that exists in our system, but it also is a symbol for us of how public awareness, galvanizing the public behind these ridiculous situations, can bring about change. And now, across the board, I mean, you've probably started to see it here in the US.
Let me pull you back. I'm still stuck on the beans. The beans in Kenya.
Yeah.
Were you successful in trying to tell the Kenyans it's ridiculous to throw these out
ridiculous.
and waste them? So did they find another channel to sell them in?
Okay, so the problem with green beans in Kenya is that the Kenyans don't eat green beans, and why should they? They call it Mzungu food. It's white man's food. The local markets for this kind of crop are almost non-existent, a small amount of demand from the Asian communities. But the African communities are not interested. Now, there is a part to play in helping to create markets for that locally. Absolutely. There is a market to play in, and indeed, we're in the process of setting up, hopefully, with the World Food Programme, a system of recovering some of these reject foods, getting them to schools and into slums to feed people who don't have enough to eat. That is definitely part of the problem. But how much better would it be if we changed the system that created the food waste in the first place to create value for farmers in the market? And that is really what I think we have the power and therefore, I would argue, the responsibility to demand that kind of change from our food businesses. Are they donating surplus food to charities? Are they working with farmers to reduce food waste in the supply chain? Are they standardizing their date labels so that we can all understand whether a food is going to kill us on an expiration date or not? Are they reporting transparently how much food they waste? These are the kinds of things that we should expect from our companies.
But surely, I'm so glad you elevated the tone of all of the Ideas Fest by using the word punnet, which is one of my favorite words, and I'm going to try to use, it means little vegetable dish, plastic dish.
A punnet?
Punnet.
Punnet.
Are we going to pun it with punnet?
No, we're not going to have any puns on punnet, but it's just a great word
First prize to the
For-
best punnet pun.
for box or vegetable. But the laws, so much of what you say, public pressure,
Yeah.
consumer activism,
Yeah.
this is all great, especially with the kind of practical steps you are outlining, but surely government regulation also plays a part in this. And tell us some of the laws that you've seen change in the UK.
So the big one and the least recognized and most fundamental piece of legislation is the one I mentioned. It's called the Groceries Code Adjudicator, and it governs the relationship between the big supermarkets, the disproportionately powerful big supermarkets, and their relatively powerless suppliers. And I mentioned how that worked. I mean, I don't feel like, do I need to go into more detail about that? But that was really a landmark piece of legislation, and the European Parliament, which we're not going to be part of anymore. But the European Parliament, massive victory a few weeks ago. We got a majority of 600 to 47 calling for that to become a European network of legislations.
But you'll have that as a legacy.
That's massive. Yeah, it's massive. We've probably all heard about the more recent French law that many in America will have read the media stories saying it obliges supermarkets to donate all of their surplus. Well, it doesn't quite do that. It obliges big supermarkets to have a relationship with a charity that can take that kind of food. The importance of this kind of legislation, in my view, is not that it will by itself eliminate food waste, nor will it, and we should all be fully cognizant of this fact, solve hunger by itself. It is not equipped to do that either. But what I think it does do is, with symbolic power, make in a very clear codification, and that's what laws are, they're a codification of the values of the society in which they operate, very clear that waste of this kind, on this scale, is not acceptable to this society anymore. And it's easy, if you're a business, to sidestep this particular piece of legislation by the letter of the law, but the reputational damage that would be incurred if you did so would be so great that it's not worth supermarkets taking that risk.
Thank you. Let's move to Congresswoman Pingree, because we have this thematic continuity between Zia and Tristram of the role of societal shaming and shifts of attitude that make it unacceptable for companies to waste as they did.
May I segue just 20 seconds, which is that it has taken years of campaigning on this issue to get to the position in Europe where we have legislation on it. The thing that has amazed me more than anything other, I started working here in the US in 2013 in a small way. In the last 18 months, this issue has been picked up more rapidly than I could possibly have imagined by corporates, by civic society organizations, and by legislators.
Well,
it has been so refreshing.
This gives me a chance to mention an article in the New Republic I wrote about food waste, in which I said, unlike almost any other issue, this has gone to 0 to 60 in 18 months, which has been remarkable. And part of it is when I spoke with Congresswoman Pingree, she essentially said, your grandmother said, stop, don't throw food away, stop wasting food. So if you're telling people not to do that, who is going to stand up for food waste? It doesn't have a constituency. But let's get into some of your own feeling that there was a chance to find some consensus and how you went about trying to find that.
Great. And thank you very much. I would say, when it comes to public policy, these things go hand in hand. And we wrote a bill called the Food Recovery Act, but part of the reason you write a bill, and we wrote a very comprehensive bill that deals with food waste on the farm, in the restaurant, consumer waste, how municipalities deal with food waste. We wanted to put everything into one bill. And it wasn't because we thought this particular Congress, which you've possibly heard that we're not really getting that much done right now, but that we would take up this omnibus food waste bill and it would suddenly pass. But because if you can put everything into one piece of legislation and anyone can pick it up and say, oh, good, you took on my idea, you got that idea, you're covering it all. People can have something to rally behind as a piece of public policy, but also, in the way legislation works, you can take a little piece out, and you can say, well, maybe I'll work on this with the tax committee, maybe I'll try to get this language into an appropriations bill. So that's kind of what we did. But it also gives us this, this launching pad to discuss all these things with groups of people and say, you know, there is something you can support. You can ask your member of Congress if they've co-sponsored it, if they're going to support it. You can ask, you know, you can ask how they feel about it or what their concerns are. So that was one of the reasons we wrote this. And as I said, we went after it in really all the ways that people are talking about here. How to give more incentives to farmers to donate their food, how to make it, give more incentives to retailers to donate food, how to deal with some of the challenges that municipalities have, because if the food waste gets beyond, you know, selling in a different counter in the grocery store, donating to a food bank, but it really does need to be disposed, we don't want it to go to a landfill because it doesn't compost in a landfill. It turns into methane gas, which is much more toxic than many of the other carbon-producing gases that we're worrying about and is terrible for our environment. And you heard Corby talk about the statistics of how much organic material in landfills has increased. That's a huge problem. So a lot of municipalities don't have the money to set up a composting operation or an anaerobic digester that can turn this waste into a usable fuel or make electricity. So incentives for that, or more funding, or changing the way funding languages and some of the other available funds that go to states and municipalities to include this as a possibility. So we just put everything but the kitchen sink in there and then have started to talk about it. And as you heard, there isn't really a constituency for food waste. And the nice thing is, it's not a partisan issue either. Luckily, everyone had a grandmother, and everyone's grandmother said, don't waste food. And frankly, everyone's grandmother, well, okay, not everyone's grandmother, but a lot of grandmothers out there also knew that if you had leftover bread, you should make bread pudding. Once you cook chicken for dinner, then you should turn the bones into stock. So,
bagel chips. We had stale bagel chips in a fattoush salad, which is always made with cut and toasted bread. So we have the example for you to have seconds on now, should you wish.
That's good. So all these things, you know, people knew more about it at home. But we were trying to, you know, get all of these things covered, and there was no constituency on the other side. And one of the real breakthroughs for us, which I think is, you know, impressive about a relatively inactive Congress, is that the Republican chair of the Agriculture Committee said, let's hold a hearing on food waste. So a month ago, we had a public hearing on this. I mean, we're just not having a lot of public hearings these days. We're not having a lot of activity around a lot of issues, and we certainly don't have common ground on very much. But it was a wonderful panel of people from industry, from consumer groups, from agriculture, all talking about all the things that we're talking about today and why legislation should move forward. So that's a real success story. It doesn't happen in everything. I've been working on agricultural policy, and I've been an organic farmer for 40 years, so I know these issues and change don't come easy. And this is one of the most fun things I've ever gotten to work on. And frankly, the more I learn about it, the most significantly important because of the environmental challenges, because of the number of people who go hungry, because of the waste of water and everything else you hear, farmers' hard work, everything else. There's a lot of problems we could solve if we could fix this, and it's going to take a lot of ways of going about it. So back to the, we write a comprehensive bill, and then we take out these little pieces. And luckily, as Corby mentioned in his article, almost without effort, although that's never true, but one of the pieces on tax relief or a tax credit went into an omnibus tax bill that was actually passed last December. It was originally a bill sponsored by a Republican, once again, not a partisan issue, and it made this donation process, it gave even more incentives. It said if you donate, it expanded who gets a credit for these donations, but it also said you get the value of the food back plus maybe 15%. So you get a little bit of an enhanced credit when you do this. So yet another way to encourage what might be a little more time or a little bit more effort that a retailer or someone else has to make. We also just recently pulled out just the section on date labeling. You heard Tristram mention that. That's one of my favorite issues to work on because I think most people understand it, and it is likely one of the most, the highest benefit cost-benefit ratios if we could fix this problem. So I always like to ask a crowd, how many of you live in a household where there is one person who says, when they see a label on a package, oh my gosh, we got to throw this away, and another person that says, that's perfectly good food? So how many of you have ever encountered this conversation? I mean, we thought about naming it something like domestic harmony legislation.
I was about to say, we have some examples of domestic harmony in this room. That's just what I was
So
going
the
to say.
truth is, except for very few cases, most labels are a decision of the manufacturer. They could be somewhat arbitrary. They could represent something that the manufacturer suggests. And as you know, most of them are not easy to understand. Sometimes they're a date, and you don't know, is that the date I'm supposed to buy it by? Is that the date I'm supposed to throw it away? Or is that the date that just says, you know, these crackers will be tastier until this date, but 6 months after that, they're not going to hurt you, and they might taste just fine. So we're trying to get a reasonable standard so that there's sort of two categories. One would say, this is best if you use it by this particular date. And then another standard that deals with those foods that really are dangerous for you. If you eat them beyond the date, they're more likely to have a food poisoning or another kind of issue that would make you sick, and that would say expires on. So it would be very clear, and then we would have consumer education around this.
And as I recall, there's a very small category of foods that are actually dangerous if they are near their sell-by date. It's hot prepared foods and baby foods.
Well, infant formula is the only product on the market right now that has a label on it that is actually, you know, a scientific determination and regulated. But everything else is unregulated. There is no government intervention in those labels. They're just a decision of the manufacturer. So our idea is, and again, the most interesting thing about this is we've gotten tremendous support, not only from households in disharmony, but from the manufacturers. I mean, when we introduced this bill just recently, the Nestle Food Company and Campbell's Soup were right there with us because they said, we would like to have this kind of understanding. It would make it easier for us when our products get donated to a food bank, and it would make it easier for us with the consumers. And that sort of helped get rid of one myth, because there were some people who thought, well, maybe the constituency is manufacturers. Maybe manufacturers like to sell a lot of food to a grocery store and then see it thrown away. But we have not encountered that. We've encountered great support. And I can just guarantee you, from working on a lot of controversial issues on food and farming, I've been on the Agriculture Committee, I'm on the Agriculture Appropriations Committee, and always trying to push the envelope on labeling or on organic standards or a whole variety of things. There's always an opponent on the other side, and these are always difficult fights. And this one, you know, they may enter the room at any moment, but so far we haven't met them yet.
And yes, please.
And I'm only just going to say, so these things very much go hand in hand. Once you have a piece of legislation and you get to talk about it and the press writes about it, then consumers start to say, oh, I haven't really thought about that. I didn't know 40% of the food was wasted. And I mean, one of the portions of this bill is to talk about consumer education. Again, because I think people will change a lot of their eating habits. There's a great, as you were saying, we used to litter. I think this is a really important component to have in school and school lunch programs, because I'm always of the belief that if you can get 3rd and 4th graders to think that recycling is important, the first thing they'll do is come home and tell their parents and not let you off the hook until you do everything right. Well, the same thing will be true of food waste. And if they're establishing that in their school cafeterias and they have a composting system in the back, or there's a share table, so if you don't want your apple, you put it here and someone else can pick it up. But consumer education would be very helpful, because a lot of this happens at the consumer level. And not only are most people unaware of it, or we've sort of forgotten it, I think a lot of people don't have that kind of history. I mean, I live on a farm, so I know it's okay, or I know when we don't eat all our food, we put it in a bucket and either goes to feed our pigs or it goes in our compost. But for a lot of people, the very idea that you would put food in a bucket with a little cover on your counter, you think you're doing something unsanitary, and the condo police will come and get you, or your neighbor from down the road will say, what have you done? But in fact, you know, in the city of San Francisco, where they're now going to mandate composting, everybody's getting educated to the idea that, you know, that's a much better idea than this sort of garbage disposal, and you don't know where all those things go, and you're not doing any good with it.
And in Boston, where I live much of the time, we are also enacting mandatory compost laws.
Oh.
And Jonathan Bloom of American Waste Land said when I spoke with him that the single most important step he thought people could take to understand and reduce their own food waste would be to be forced to compost, not because it's going to do that much good or recover that much food or to add to the agricultural system, but simply to show them how much food they are losing and not using in their own households. And so for individual behavior change, he said mandatory composting was it. Zia, before we open this to questions, which I invite you to think of now, are there more areas of system change that you would like to see or would encourage?
Sure, I'll just make a couple of points, building off some of the comments that have already been made. So one is, I completely agree that this is an issue that is moving very quickly. At the Foundation, we touch a lot of topics on urban issues, employment issues, health and agriculture. And it's amazing how quickly this has gotten traction. And what's really interesting is that there are fewer, they're growing, champions on food waste, but it does fit into so many other agendas that it gets welcomed as an agenda item. So ranging from people who are worried about the environment, who are worried about water issues, farmer incomes and livelihoods, nutrition advocates are paying more attention to this, and even corporations as they're trying to rethink their role in society and how can they do things that integrate better with society. So it's an amazing agenda and how it fits and aligns with other directions that are happening. And then just to touch on this last point, the thing that I guess I worry about the most, and we are thinking about a lot, is if you think about change happening in society, technology is usually the thing that changes the quickest, and culture is the thing that changes the slowest. So I'll just give a short anecdote. I talk about my work with my family, and I was going home for my niece had a graduation party from high school, and we went to an Indian restaurant. My family's of Indian origin. And my mother ordered the food, and there was 3 times as much food as we needed. And even as much as I've talked to my parents about this issue, even as much as my mother has told me to finish all my food, the idea of running out of food at a party would cast shame for 10 generations. And so it was just unacceptable to even think along those lines. But what if the hospitality industry could have a conversation with people and say, look, if you are more conservative and if you think that it's possible to run out of food, these are the options that are available to you. But these are the kinds of cultural changes that a lot of the distinctive examples that were put out on in this conversation, this is what's going to be so important. How do we change how we think about buying food, cooking food, what's acceptable and not? And to pick up, Tristram, on your word absurd, I think it is absurd when we look at it, but it's not absurd to everyone who is working with a different set of assumptions, and how can we change those underlying assumptions?
Thank you. I'm going to open this to questions, but I am going to be asking you for your favorite things you would advocate for in the next few years of change. So get your lists ready, please. We have a woman right in the front? Could we start with her? And we've got, good. Then we'll have the gentleman at the middle table. If you could pass your mic to the gentleman after you're done.
No problem. Well, I am from San Francisco and I'm excited about the mandate. We've actually had the ability to compost, but I'd say 50-50 among my friends. So very exciting times on that mode. But I want to know, we've heard a lot about we have to get rid of waste, but then there's the issue of the waste that's already there. And you spoke about it a bit on the digesters and other the issues with the landfill. How do you guys think about that?
I guess I didn't completely you mean the waste that we're already creating?
We all want to get rid of it, but we already have a tremendous amount of waste, and we're going to slowly get less and less waste, but we have to have a mechanism or technology to deal with the current waste.
Well, certainly, organic material is a huge part of what goes into a landfill. So if we could, if there was a mandate or a ban, or it was just culturally, like Portland, Maine, that I represent, doesn't have a mandate, but they have 2 companies now competing to pick up your compost, and they give you a bucket in return or something, you get a little bit back. But it's already becoming a cultural change that they're going to go about doing, which will be less cost to the municipality, which is a cost break for the people who live in that city. So I feel like if we could move some of that, or to composting, if that became regular for municipalities, and again, some of it has to do with government funding. Most states are dependent on some federal funding to help deal with landfills and solid waste. And That's been a big component of this. So just by changing the language and either giving an incentive or making it possible for that money to go there could make a big difference. You're also talking about the issue of waste. And let's face it, some of this goes along with, we've become a culture that's used to abundance, and we're very wasteful. And food packaging is a really important component of that. I mean, how many times you get a little thing of cookies and you realize it's this complicated plastic thing that separates them all out? We'd all complain if our cookies were broken, but on the other hand, we're just wasting a lot of packaging doing that. And I think that's a whole other conversation. And some companies are trying to make biodegradable packaging and things like that. But that's certainly a big issue.
I just want to add a small caveat to that. I mean, there's something called the food waste hierarchy or food recovery hierarchy that says prevention is the #1 priority. If a company has surplus food and it's fit for consumption, donating it for human consumption is the next best option. The third, and this will be my favorite option, I'll come on to that, will be livestock as the third. And then the fourth and fifth are composting and anaerobic digestion. And if I have any role when I come over to the United States, it is to try to prevent, now that food waste is getting so much traction, the US from repeating Europe's mistake, which is massively overemphasizing the importance of diversion from landfill as part of the whole package. Of course, we have to do it. And of course, composting and AD are better food waste management solutions than landfill, but they are food waste management solutions. It is still food waste. Dumping banana skin into compost, good. Dumping bananas into compost is still a waste of all of the land, resources, energy, etc., that went into producing the banana. And getting the policies right so as not to get people so psyched up that you can turn food waste into electricity that they feel cool about filling their compost bin, or supermarkets get away with PR things saying, we've solved food waste, now it's going to produce enough energy for, you recover around 1% of the energy that went into the food. None of the land, none of the water, none of the biodiversity impacts. So not allowing people off the hook just by changing the management system. Reduction is the key.
So remember that hierarchy. Gentlemen.
How do you come up with a number of 30 to 40% waste? Because it's not only waste, but I don't know how you measure waste. In other words, we're farmers, or I'm a farmer, okay? And we do a lot of like grapefruit in Florida, not in Florida, in Texas.
And what kind of food?
Grapefruit in Texas. And a third of our grapefruit doesn't meet the standard to sell in the supermarkets. The only reason it doesn't meet the standard is the way it looks. That then is turned, some of it's into juice and some of it's into feed for cattle. So how do you measure the waste? I mean, I could argue that what goes to cattle feed is waste. I don't know if you measure that as waste. And even what you turn to juice may be waste because you're taking out a good quantity of the benefit of the product and turning it into juice. So how do you do that?
So there has been an enormous amount of debate about the definition of food waste and coming to a consensus about what you count as food waste and what you don't. And you've just spot on hit on the... Everyone will agree, there's no controversy, the stuff going into juice, that's not waste, that is going for human consumption. There is a lot of controversy about whether food intended for human consumption that goes for livestock should be counted as waste or not. And then there's all the stuff below that that goes for all the other left in field or whatever, defining that as food waste. Or indeed food loss, as the case may be. And the thing that I really want to emphasize on this point is that people get trapped into the idea that they have to come up with a binary solution to this question. Is it food waste or is it not food waste? That is beside the point, your definition. What you're interested in is resource utilization optimization, observing the hierarchy. That's the important thing. And you use whatever you can for the highest possible purpose.
So if you had the ideal of imperfect grapefruits, and we should add that when we talk about technology, there are many, many apps now and services. One is a company called Imperfect Produce. It's in San Francisco that is trying to sell this and make it acceptable and make it accessible to consumers. But so how would your hierarchy work for a Texan grapefruit?
So it's exactly as the gentleman just said. He's got his primary product. He's got a secondary market for the stuff that he can't sell. That is total sense. And he does what most farmers do with anything left over. He'll send it to livestock feed. It will be in your economic interests if somebody comes along, like Ben Simon and Ron Clark, who set up Imperfect, actually just after having met at Feeding the 5,000 in Oakland in 2014, to go and market.
You were involved.
Of course. You know, this is what it's all about, getting people together and coming up with these great solutions. But so if Ben Simon and Ron Clark come to you and say, you know those grapefruits, I don't know what you're selling them to livestock farmers for, but it's going to be a fraction of what you're selling as your primary product. We've created a market. There are thousands of people out there who want those undersized, oversized, slightly kind of skin-scarred grapefruits that you can't use for anything else, and we will sell them at a good price to customers. You're going to get more revenue. You're going to go for that, right? Because that's higher in the hierarchy and obviously more revenue to you.
I want to add one thing. When we were,
Sorry? Yeah.
Scale.
That's a joke. The demand they're creating.
Sorry.
The demand they're creating against the supply is so small.
right.
Right. But when Walmart...
It's wonderful, it does no good.
But when Walmart relaxes its cosmetic standards, which is what the ultimate task of all of these educational ugly fruit, I agree. So the ugly fruit and vegetable thing is important not solely, or perhaps not primarily because of the produce they use, but as the wider communication tool. And this is what we've done in the United Kingdom. There's all these ugly fruit and all the major supermarkets now are carrying imperfectly perfect or ugly or wonky or whatever. But the important thing is it communicates to the public that this is what happens to the stuff on the rest of the thing, and it gives the supermarket power to relax the cosmetic standards so that that percentage of rejects goes down.
And I just want to add one thing. When we were writing our bill, we looked at the grading standards. So some of this isn't necessarily driven by the supermarket, but there are grades of, USDA, grade A, grade B, all those things. And we decided not to tackle it in the bill because there's a certain intervention by each sort of trade association. There's the way the grapefruit people want to grade and the potato people want to grade. But it is actually, I think, a very important part of this conversation because the grocery store is sometimes just saying, I will only accept grade A peaches. Mm-hmm. So grade A peaches have certain designations. They may be a certain size, lack of blemishes, certain color. But the fact is most grading standards were not determined for flavor. They were determined for appearance.
I actually recoil when I think of perfect peaches in supermarkets because I assume they're rock hard
Exactly.
and have no taste.
It's like, on our farm, we can get a lot more money for an heirloom tomato than a perfectly round red tomato because you kind of have a sense now that that heirloom tomato, as bumpy and ugly as it is going to just melt in your mouth. So the consumer is changing, but the grading hasn't changed. So some of it's about the supermarket, but some of it is actually these USDA standards, which we would like to tackle, and we would like to give the consumer the opportunity to say, I want things that taste good. I do not want things that are for somebody else's convenience and how they look and how well they transport in a truck. So it's a complicated system, but I think we could fix it, and some of it is by making ugly fruit popular because then the market's going to drive it too.
Gentleman on the side.
Similar question, and it was kind of a majority of what he was saying there, but I just wanted to follow up on it. So I've seen statistics of like 20 to 40% of fruits and vegetables at the farm level, at the culling level, is rejected because of the blemishes. I wonder, is there any way to incentivize the farmers themselves? If it's not just for, I love the idea, we could sell it to imperfect produce, that would be great. But to the point earlier, the scale issue is huge. But is there a way to incentivize it to go to food pantries and food banks? I mean, the issues of transportation, the issues of getting a truck that's going to pick up the food that isn't going to be sold and getting it into the hands of people who are going hungry or don't have food security.
Well, I would just say in this tax provision, which has already passed, that was one of the reasons to have this idea of an enhanced donation, and it applies to farmers now as well. So if they're willing to take the trouble to pick up, food that might have otherwise been left in the field or fed to livestock or something else, they can get, and they make sure it gets to a food bank, then they get a credit for that, which is the value plus it's enhanced to 10 to 15% to recognize that they had to go to extra work to give it away.
I think this legislative approach has been really effective. What we've done in the UK and now launched across Europe is gleaning programs. So we're taking volunteers to fields to harvest stuff. And again, touching on the point, it's not about the few hundred tons you go and collect and get it to people who need it. It's about the fact that that provides an enormous communications value. You can take, as we did, Jamie Oliver, and Jamie Oliver's #2 celebrity chef, Hugh Fanny Whittingstall, gleaning, you get it onto mainstream television. That creates the demand, the awareness, and the accountability that drives supermarkets to say, whether it's the chopping of the beans that I mentioned earlier, or the grading that they put on the private standards. That's how you change the system, is by bringing in awareness of the problem and driving that policy change on the part of the supermarkets.
Great. We have one last question.
Hello? Okay. It's a very important conversation. I'd like to get back into the food labeling as far as the expiration dates, because I can't underscore how important that is, especially on the consumer level. I mean, especially when you think about, as an average consumer, you think about all the data points we have in our kitchen, and it's almost impossible just to keep track of all, not only the expiration dates, but not all expiration dates are created equal. Where are we at as far as the transition to more of a best buy versus a spoilage date? And then once that occurs, how can we inform consumers to be able to make use of that food, so once we have that we can actually take actionable, make that actionable as a consumer? So, thanks.
Well, all great questions. And again, your point is a good one. I think it's not only is this shown to be the best cost benefit because so much food is thrown away because of this, but in 20 states in the country, you're not allowed to sell anything beyond this expiration date, even if the expiration date isn't necessarily a scientific issue. I mean, it's just, you're not allowed to. So to have some uniformity in that and to get rid of the confusion that happens there would be a huge thing. So, I mean, we're anxious to move forward on this piece of legislation, but simultaneously, I think a lot of the big manufacturing companies, the grocers, they're talking about this too. And if these two things could sort of move forward on the same front, I think we could move this fairly quickly. I think it's the kind of thing that Congress could agree on and set a national standard. But along with it needs to be some consumer education. And I think, again, manufacturers can help with that. And also we're hoping to get a little bit of funding to educate consumers, because this is an easy one to change. But it would take a little bit of background so people know what it means.
Well, thank you all. Can we go down for a wish list?
A wish list. I guess my wish list for the model, and it just touches on the point that you just made, which is there are some cultural drivers to why the status quo is the status quo. So supermarkets, in a sense, are an expression of a perfect industrial agriculture system where we can have perfect food available all the time. At the home, we don't really know if yellow kale is easy to eat or not easy to eat. So if I had a wish list, it would be just this change of awareness around reconnecting to understanding food, what is safe, what is not safe, and to make more explicit our current assumptions that are driving the status quo so that all these very available solutions can take hold more quickly.
Great.
Well, simple one, I'd love to get this date labeling bill passed because I think it would have a huge impact. It would create a lot of awareness and change things very quickly. And in the big picture, I'm very much about how we change our food and agricultural system in this country and move away from so much monoculture, so much transporting food across the country, get more back to a local agricultural system. I represent a state in New England, and New England's seen this just enormous growth and a resurgence of farming, people wanting to buy more locally, but also diversified farming. So some of the things that we were talking about, if you raise a few animals and you have some crops, and you've got waste crops, you either give them away at the end of the farmer's market so the people in your town need them, get them, you take them to the food pantry, or you feed them to the animals. So they're much better systems altogether. You're more likely to compost on your land. I'd like to see us go back to more appropriate farming practices that would help with the sustainability in the first place.
Unsurprisingly, I find myself in alignment. So the Rockefeller Foundation has funded my organization, Feedback, to come to the USA to add our energy and voice to the food waste movement here in the USA, and really galvanizing public opinion and bringing on board all of these other stakeholders is really what we're trying to do in the USA. But if I have a single ask, it is that we keep in mind the long game. For me, food waste, it is a colossal issue with enormous potential benefits if we can tackle it. But beyond that, it's proving to be quintessentially an issue that engages a mass public in a way that it has proved very difficult to engage the public on some of the other major issues with our food system, deforestation, GMOs, all of these, sustainable farming more generally. It is difficult to grasp for people who are busy why we should care about all of these issues, how we and our choices relate to deforestation in South America, or soil erosion, or carbon dioxide emissions, or species extinction, or whatever it is. It's difficult. And food waste, we should be thinking of as a way in for people to get engaged with food system sustainability more generally. Ultimately, if we as a society cannot stand up, change our food system radically, the mass species extinction that we are currently, this isn't a future danger. This is happening right now. We are eliminating most of the species on this planet, and the trends are that they will mostly be gone by the end of this century if we do not radically reform our food system. Plus, most carbon dioxide emissions come from food. Plus, most fresh water comes from food production. And we have to use food waste as a way of bringing people on board with those much bigger issues, much harder issues to tackle.
Well, so these are all tackling issues that the Aspen Institute is very engaged in, and it is a perfect transition to our deep dive, which I invite you all to attend with some of the same panelists happening in this room at 1:15. You've helped set the agenda for future Ideas Festivals and indeed for the rest of this Ideas Festival. And I also invite you to go out and have several punnets worth of additional food there to make sure that we don't waste it, although I will assure you that we have systems in place to make sure that that food doesn't get wasted. But enjoy it. It's so good, as our panelists have been so stimulating and active and inspiring. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you.